Hi, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Chasing Energy. Yes, I took a little bit of break, and for good reason. I was spending a lot of time editing the podcast, and it didn't seem to be gathering a lot of traction. And when you combine those two things, it becomes harder to sort of keep the podcast going. So, lack of reviews, lack of feedback, and things like that caused me to question how much time I was spending on the podcast. Now, I'm sure you're not really interested in my problems, but I am giving you the reason that it just became a big time suck for me. I used to wonder when people would stop podcasting. I'd be like, man, they quit. I can't believe they quit. And then I became that person. So now I'm going to answer the question, why am I recording after a hiatus? There's a couple of reasons. One is that I get questions every so often, when are you bringing the podcast back? To which I think to myself, where were you when I asked for reviews and things like that? But it is good to know. It gives me a tingle inside when I think that other people are listening to this and that it somehow, some way brings value to their life. The other part of that is that I am constantly researching and gathering information, and during my many voice journaling sessions where I talk to myself and think about things and, what am I doing? I've become a little more convinced that it's kind of selfish to gather all this information and then do nothing with it. I essentially just use it for myself. And I had a friend tell me the other day, they were saying, one of your gifts is that you take topics that are intimidating and very frustrating to people, and certainly in regards to health, there's other topics as well, and you tend to break them down into ways that people understand. Now, there might have been a little bit of flattery in there. I don't know, but it stuck with me enough to say it might be time for me to do a few more episodes and see if it's a little better received. The last reason that I'm bringing the podcast back, or at least the last reason I'm going to mention today, is that I have been paying for things like Buzzsprout and Descript, which were my podcast editing tools. And just for giggles the other day, I was like, man, I'm paying for these tools every month. I should at least get in there and make some projects for YouTube or Instagram. And when I started playing with them, I realized how far the AI has come. Now, AI is integrated into tools like Descript, and what used to take me probably at least 2 hours of diligent work would take me probably 6 to 10 minutes now. So when I saw that, I became convinced, okay, maybe instead of 2 nights a week, I can get it down to 1 night a week. The thing that I'm going to mention to you about moving forward with the podcast, I don't know if it was insecurity or what, but I very rarely did any type of solo cast where I just gave you information that I was working on or an insight that maybe I found useful. I spent so much time trying to find guests for the podcast and get on their schedule and do things like that. It became kind of frustrating for me, especially when you're kind of an unknown podcaster. Not a lot of people are fighting to get on your podcast, man. They're kind of like, who are you? Why? And I had some really wonderful guests. I'm very, very proud of those. But here's my point. I'm not going to make my posting of this podcast contingent on having a guest. In fact, I'm probably not going to seek them out as actively as I used to. If I can find one on a topic that I'm trying to research or I think they have information to share, I'm going to bring them on. Otherwise, I'm going to share with you some insights that I'm working on and maybe some information that I'm struggling with. This is a two-way conversation because I always keep the line open. You can always just reach out to me at dplucas on Instagram, send me a message, post in one of my comments. But I keep the channels open, and then there's always the review boards on your local podcast listing, which I make sure that this podcast is listed just about everywhere. So the last thing I want to talk to you about today is, what have I been working on over the last year and a half-ish, since the podcast has basically not been updated since then. And I think it's going to be very, very obvious that I've been very busy. I was starting to question whether this podcast was impacting the world. And I think that was a healthy question because I just didn't see a lot of view counts and things like that. And just like I said, I started to question the amount of time I was spending in. Once you take 2 weeks off, it is very hard to get back on that wagon, especially when there's not a paycheck involved or any type of direct compensation. I began to think, what could I do to actually impact the world in a positive way that was more scalable? And there was an invention I was working on. I don't think I've mentioned it hardly at all on my podcast, but I can assure you I've been working on it since before the podcast even started. From the very first podcast, this was a big thing I was working on. And that is the Sprout Spout. By the time you hear this, the Sprout Spout will have launched, and it has a Shopify page. And mostly up until last week, it was just like friends and family who check in and they're trying to be supportive. Here and there, someone would see a post on Instagram or something and give it a shot. But that is starting to change. Last week, True Leaf Market put us in their newsletter. We had a nice little bump in sales. And next week, I'm going to Las Vegas to pitch to the pros. It is a very big deal. There's some very big names in there. That panel is going to include Damon John, who you may know from Shark Tank. It's also got Christopher Guerra, who's been on Shark Tank a few times. Yvette Taylor, Rudy Moyer, Jason Pfeiffer, Courtney Spritzer, and my good friend Carmine. These are very powerful people in the industry that I'm super humbled that they're even giving me the time of day. My very good friend Carmine Donesco, and I'm cautious when I say the term my good friend because, a lot of times when you have these guests, they're friendly and they're acquaintances. But Carmine and I go back and we've been through some stuff together. And I had the opportunity to spend a day with him last month. And he's someone I think very highly of. I think he comes across as a little bit of an old school, like New Yorker, kind of brash. But man, let me tell you, when you need help, that guy is there. And he has served me in ways that I can tell you right now, I wouldn't be talking about the Sprout Spout right now if it weren't for Carmine. I'm so blessed to have people in my corner who have come out of nowhere, effectively nowhere, and said, I want to help you get to the next level. And the biggest thing I want to leave you with today is that Stephen Pressfield has a book called The War on Art, I believe is what it's called. Do the work. And in it, he talks about the different stages you go through when you are on your personal hero's journey. And if you know anything about Joseph Campbell, who came up with the philosophy of the hero's journey, it's based on, thousands of these ancient legends that people would talk about in the old days of Rome and Greek mythology and all these things. But the point is this: when you embark on the hero's journey, and everyone has the opportunity in their life to have their own hero's journey, it doesn't mean that everybody takes it. And the first part of a hero's journey is that they generally refuse the call, or they don't really want to do it. It becomes to where they feel like they almost don't have a choice. That is exactly how I feel with the Sprout Spout. It was something that was fun, it was entertaining, and then when it became super, super real and it was sink or swim, I had to make the choice. Is this just a fun project that I'm bragging to my friends that I'm actually building this thing? Or am I willing to actually spend, much like I was with the podcast, nights and weekends and a heck of a lot of money to bring this thing to the world? And once that decision was made, it was only the beginning. And if I had known what was ahead of me, if someone had said, this is what's going to happen, my younger self who saw this would have never stepped up. But alas, here I am, and I am in what Pressfield would refer to as the belly of the beast. I'm in that mode where right now, for the last month or two, it feels like if I blink for 1 second, this project will disappear. This product will disappear from the world. And I don't want that to happen. So I have burnt the ships behind me, if you will. I have made commitments to people, commitments to places. I have spent a lot of money. I have invested a lot of things to change the person who I am. We will have an entire podcast on how the person I am has been changing. But for now, what I want to tell you is I've made the decision that I am here to make the world a healthier place. The Sprout Spout is undeniably my best achievement in terms of making the world a healthier place. I was always an ambassador of health. I can think of some wonderful people that I ended up convincing them to start taking care of themselves and running or biking or eating right. And when they come up to me 5-10 years later, it really flatters me when they say, I was a mess and then you were constantly staying on me and I finally, I just stepped in, or you ran with me that time, or you started critiquing my food and helped me get my diet under control. Those are great things that I will take with me to the grave. But I also had to start questioning, these are small, like occasional things when they fall into my hands. It's not the kind of thing I've sought out and tried to scale up beyond my local circle of friends. So the Sprout Spout was my way of saying this is something that I can scale and impact the world in a positive way. As Steve Jobs would say, it's my way of putting a dent in the universe. So, cheers for joining back on the podcast. I'm so grateful that you did. If you go in and put a review, especially on Apple, that would be helpful. That's my call to action for you. We're going to be going through a lot of action calls that I have for myself over the next few weeks, and I plan to keep you in the loop. If you have any questions that you want me to address on the podcast, you know how to get a hold of me. Just go on to Instagram, @DPLucas, send me a note. I'll try to go through it and put it on my podcast notes of things to research. We have a lot to cover together over the next several months. I look forward to the journey. Thank you for joining.